Alright, welcome to this short video on some Virtuoso 101 best practices. Right, so we're going to first talk about Virtuoso in terms of how it is structured. And there are 6 levels essentially. So there's an organization, which is effectively your tenant within Virtuoso, which is where everything belongs. You then have projects. So they're like containers for all of your test sets, your goals, and then the underlying journeys. So these could be, for instance, where you're testing different applications. For example, you contain them within a project. We then have goals. So goals are like test sets. They are the container for a whole bunch of tests or journeys that are targeted towards an overall objective of testing. And the goals generally follow the structure of an application. For example, it could be each module of the application would be a goal. And then under the goals, we have the journeys. So these are the tests themselves. And we call them journeys because the tests are more like user-focused flows, so journeys through the application. Within the journeys, we then have checkpoints. So you can break the journey into checkpoints that can be reused. Things like the login steps or navigate to a particular module. And ideally, each of these checkpoints should contain a testing assertion. So make sure there's a testing outcome. If I log in, I get taken to the dashboard. And then finally, you have the steps, the individual steps of a test. For instance, click login. So let's take a quick look at that. So here we have an organization, which is the Virtuoso Sales Engineering Organization. We then have a project, which is actually my personal project here, in which I contain a whole bunch of testing goals. So I go into my project, and then I have a whole bunch of goals, so test sets. And in this case, for instance, I'm testing the Dynamics 365 Sales module, for example, in a goal. If I drill into there, I then have different journeys, different tests. For instance, create a new opportunity with an account and a contact. I have a Power App example. If I drill into the journey, I've then broken my journey into checkpoints. So this is one test, but I've broken it into checkpoints. For instance, navigate to the URL, the login steps, an account, create a new contact, and so on. And then of course, underneath inside the checkpoint, I have steps. So that's the basic hierarchy of the platform. So next, how should you think about structuring your tests? So a really good way, as we called out, a project is typically to test, let's say, it could be an application. So for instance, a CRM, so Salesforce or Dynamics 365. You then have the goals, which are typically to test the different parts of that application, the different modules. So it could be sales, marketing, reporting. Each of those would be a goal. And then the journeys beneath would be to test the different flows within each of those modules. For instance, in the sales module, I might test creating an account, create a contact, create an opportunity as separate journeys. So maybe just sit down and think about how you structure those. Now, when building journeys, there are a few key practices. The first is that the first checkpoint in the journey is always the same. And this is because the goal should be targeting one area of an application. So the URL is always going to be the same. Navigate to the URL. It's the same across all journeys in the goal. So it's kind of best practice to say in your first checkpoint, ideally only have the most common steps that will be shared across every test, every journey within that goal. I'd say to keep it simple, just have it navigate to the URL. So therefore, before you create your second step in the test, create a new checkpoint. And then get used to splitting the steps into segments. And these are the checkpoints, which we'll talk about in just a moment. In terms of the length of journeys, on average, our customers build journeys on average 64 steps long. It's a pretty good length. And in the testing world, there are 4 key things to keep in mind when building your journeys. Keep them decoupled. Each test should be able to run by itself. Keep it granular. Focus on testing a single outcome. For instance, create an opportunity. Unambiguous. Everyone can understand what's being tested. And maintainable. So avoid duplicating your test. So for example, instead of having 10 tests to create 10 opportunities with different data sets, use parameters to test different scenarios or environments. And again, we'll cover that in just a moment. And again, just a quick look at what that looks like. So you can see here how we've got the very first step in our journey is just navigating to the URL. And we can see how that is shared across all the journeys. It's a common one. It's always shared. So therefore, ideally just keep the navigating to the URL in that step. So before I create my second step, I would add a checkpoint, give it a title. And again, with the checkpoints, it's keeping that so that it's, for instance, here, the login steps. Try and break it into these segments. And in this case as well, we are creating an opportunity with a new account and contact. This test can run on its own. It doesn't need anything else. And the way we've done that is by using things like parameters and variables for the data, which we'll be covering in just a second. So next, checkpoints. So these really are a great way to segment the tests into different segments. And this also enables reusability. So checkpoints should follow a single flow. For instance, log in or navigate to a particular page, or maybe create the opportunity. So give them meaningful titles so that people can read them, but also because we're going to be making checkpoints more reusable than ever before. Put in an assertion at the end of your checkpoint. So it means, for instance, if you log in, put a step like look for the dashboard if the result of logging in is then you see a page with the title dashboard. And like we said in the last slide, just to reinforce, the first checkpoint is always the same. So ideally, just put the navigate to a URL in there. Okay, test data. So unless you're just going to run simple tests like smoke tests that just use a single environment and single test data set, you're always going to use John Smith in your test. It's a good idea to decouple the test from the data. And what that means is you can use variables, so basically data placeholders. So instead of writing an email address, so add the actual email address into the test, you can write $username, for example. And then all you have to do is map in a source for that data. So perhaps a test data table with values for $username. So when you write your test steps, putting in variables, so instead of navigate to the URL or write the exact email address, then a variable allows you to say navigate to URL, navigate to $email. Bearing in mind, you can define these, and we'll look at that in just a second. So you can call these variables what you want. But what you can also do the first time you write a test is you may not have a source of data for that variable. So what you can do is put in a default value. So for instance, write $email with default james.b@virtuoso.q in username. It just means if there's no source of data for that variable, it will use the default value. So in this way, when you write the test, it's set up to be maintainable when the data is defined, which could come from stored data, expressions, test data, environments, random data, API calls, or calls into the database. And so you can see we've got an example of that just here, where I've write username with default, and I've got the default email address in the email phone. Equally here, I've got placeholders, for instance, TB password. So I'm writing a value, which is actually redacted. That's actually coming from, if we jump over here, the environments. So you can see I've got a value in the environment, which is basically setting up an environment for, let's say, it could be a dev or a stage or a production. And I'm defining that variable, which means I'm literally creating to say TB password, and then I could put my password value in here, mark that as sensitive. So I'm creating a variable. So this is where you can set that name. So $TB password, $password, and then you put the value in this case coming from environment data. Equally, we have test data. So you could upload a CSV file and again, define your variables and then the data that will go in there. But then you can also do things like API calls to be able to, again, create the data so that when you return an API response and it's returned, then you are creating, again, variables. So for instance, $response.data.id, that would return 546, for example. Okay, so wait times. Typically in automation, because the automation is running really quickly, it doesn't take into account that the application might not run as quick as the automation. So historically in coded automation, you might put in wait 2 seconds as a hard wait. Now you don't really need that in Virtuoso for a few reasons. One is we have a thing called wait for network traffic. So I'll show you how to do this. This basically waits for the page to load. So there's network traffic, so literally things happening between the application and the backend via the network, which is loading. So if we can see that something's loading, we wait for it. Now, if you did need to put in a wait time, instead of waiting 2 seconds, which typically people put in the longest amount of time for the application to load, but when the application is running quickly, it means the test is running slowly. You can do a dynamic wait. So wait for elements, so it might be wait for dashboard, which converts to wait 20 seconds for the dashboard. So either it waits 20 seconds or for the element to load, whichever's quickest. So it allows the test to run really quickly. But of course, then if for any reason you do need a hard wait, of course, you can, let's say, wait 5 seconds. So in this test, in the main, I'm not using wait times at all, because what we have enabled in the goal settings is a feature called wait for network traffic. And when this is enabled, every time things happen, so every time you press a button or write something in a box, we're basically looking to see if there is network traffic, if the application's doing something. And if we can see that, we wait for it to stop, let's say loading, before moving on to the next step. So this just actually lets the test run at the speed of the application. Equally, if you did need, for instance, here I've said wait for my active accounts, which converts to wait 20 seconds. So it's either wait 20 seconds or for my active accounts. If my active accounts loads in a second, the test moves on. But then as you see here, if I did need it, I could just say wait 2, and that converts to wait 2 seconds. And then finally, planning for test execution. So how do you build out and orchestrate which tests you want to be able to run? So given that we advise that goals should be roughly aligned to the different modules of the application, what happens if you want to run only certain tests from different areas of the application? So you don't want to run all of them. So still go ahead and set up your goals and journeys as we've defined previously. So a goal would be roughly a module of the application and a journey test within that module. But then use the execution planner to build your test plans. So piece together different journeys from different goals. And if you followed that decoupled advice, so each journey can run in isolation, these execution plans are very flexible and they allow you to build and manage how the tests are run. So that's the final thing we're going to look at the end of this 101. So let's just take a look at that. Otherwise, these are the things you need to consider for best practice with Virtuoso as a 101. So then just finally looking at that, we can see if we go to the sidebar and execution planner, we can see that I can build a plan if I just edit this one. So then I could come in and let's say I could pick from my R1 copy. I'm going to come in, I'm only going to run the first and third, and I'm going to add that in. So now I can orchestrate, for instance, here I've picked some from one goal, some from another. I'm building together and piecing together the different journeys so that when I then run this regression pack execution planner, which could be scheduled or run from CI/CD, it will run the selected journeys in here. So this is the way you can orchestrate your tests without having to think about doing so within the goals themselves. So that's our Virtuoso 101 best practices to get you started. Now it's time to get automating.